A fringe right-wing legal theory is sweeping through the Trump administration, and it threatens the very foundation of American democracy. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Mark Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
You know, Paige, we seem to spend a lot of time doing videos about fringe right-wing theories that are like ticking time bombs ready to blow up and end democracy. We spent a lot of time on the fringe independent state legislature theory that would have, if successfully advanced, essentially gutted the ability of state courts to apply their state constitutions to protect their citizens in voting cases. But even that pales in comparison to what we are facing now in the so-called unitary executive theory.
Right. This is a right-wing fringe idea that somehow the president has unlimited power to control the actions of the nearly 4 million people who make up the executive branch. He can fire whoever he wants. He can nominate whoever he wants. He could put people in charge that are not Senate confirmable to do certain things. And basically everyone in the executive branch just has to listen to the president and do exactly what he says with no consequence.
Yeah, and I want people to understand just how sweeping this is, okay? It is not just that he can control everything in the executive branch, and he can hire and fire. So let's just walk through a couple things. He can dispose of independent agencies. He actually issued an executive order. Many of you may not know, saying that he was doing exactly that only he could interpret what the law is, not independent agencies. He can fire civil servants for no reason other than he wants to replace them with his own political loyalists. He can fire people like inspectors general, which he's done, who are watchdogs, who are supposed to be independent so that they can root out waste, fraud, and abuse. He can decide that, notwithstanding what the experts say a policy is, notwithstanding whether the experts say a chemical is safe or a chemical is not safe, whether a pollutant is destroying clean water or clean air, he can disregard all that and say, I don't care what those scientists think. I alone get to decide whether that chemical goes in the water or doesn't go in the water. This is a very, very dangerous theory. This is a theory that basically says the president of the United States is unbounded in his power in how the law is executed. You know, Congress can appropriate funds, but he can decide not to spend them. They can appropriate it for one purpose and he can reprogram them for something else. This is a fancy name dreamed up by a bunch of Federalist Society types for what is really just the raw exercise of power and for what Donald Trump himself has told us he believes it means. He's a king, he's a dictator, and he is above the law. And Paige, I hope people understand that, just putting a fancy legal name on it doesn't make it anything better than that.
I think it's important to note that this theory predates the Trump administration. Right-wing conservatives have been working on it for decades. It really developed during the Nixon and Reagan administrations and then gained traction during the W. Bush administration. But really, it says that the president is in charge of everyone and everything, and there's very few ways to stop him. And I think, Mark, what's very interesting is that the Trump administration is trying to dress up how they're using the theory. And when they issue executive orders or talk about it in press conferences, you'll hear President Trump or his spokespeople say a lot about how he's the democratically elected leader and that the American people have given him a mandate for sweeping change and to completely reform the government, and just doing whatever he wants is a part of that.
Right. And it's ironic because these are the same people who were constantly, when I was on Twitter, they would constantly, every time I would post something about Democracy Docket, they'd say, we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. And look, we are both a constitutional republic and a democracy, right? Those are not inconsistent things, but it is important to recognize that in our country, there are separation of powers. And that is in the U.S. Constitution. There are restraints on each of the branches of government, and that is in the Constitution. And that is more important. That is supreme above the whims of any one elected official. I mean, the whole point of having a written constitution, of having a government of checks and balances, of having enumerated powers and limits on government power, is precisely to say that we do not have a king, we do not have a dictator, we do not have anyone, even if they are president, even if they were popularly elected, even if they were elected by much larger margins than he was, that we do not have anyone who is above the Constitution. We do not have anyone who can ignore the courts. We do not have anyone who, as president, can decide not to spend appropriated funds or to spend money in ways that are inconsistent with Congress, because that's what the Constitution provides. And so the Constitution is still the last line of defense there. I founded Democracy Docket 5 years ago to help expose Republican voter suppression and be a critical tool in the fight for free and fair elections. Well, since then, it has been on the front lines, tracking lawsuits, breaking news, and holding those in power to account. You know, democracy doesn't defend itself. It takes all of us. And by becoming a premium member of Democracy Docket, you'll help sustain its critical work for years to come. So please, click on the link above or in the description below to sign up and help power Democracy Docket for the next 5 years. Paige, I want to say, you say that this was a doctrine that goes back all the way to the Reagan and Nixon era, and that is entirely correct. There is something sort of weirdly poetic about the fact that it goes back to Nixon. Maybe that origin story should have been a cautionary tale, but it has been around for a long time. But when we used to talk about the independent state legislature theory, this theory that the courts state courts can't apply their state constitutions to invalidate state laws that violate the rights of their citizens with voting. One of the things we always talked about was there was a strong form and a weak form, right? The strong form of independent state legislature theory was that governors couldn't even veto acts of the legislature, right? Remember, there's this cartoonish version of independent state legislature theory, and then there's the version that that gets sort of dressed up in right-wing circles as more respectable. Well, that is also true with the unitary executive theory, right? There was a version of this, as you say, in the Bush era, which I didn't agree with, but was sort of dressed up. It was not a George W. Bush can do anything he wants. It was not a George Bush can ignore court orders. It was not a George Bush doesn't have to pay attention to congressional appropriations. It was not even, by the way, that independent agencies heads could be fired. And it definitely was not that he gets to decide on a case-by-case basis who gets criminally prosecuted. I mean, the attorneys general under George Bush had independence from the White House. It was a much subtler version of the unitary executive theory. It was not a fire all the civil servants and replace them with political cronies version. Again, I'm not defending George W. Bush. I'm not defending the unitary executive theory. I have never thought that this was constitutionally sound. It is not something that the courts have adopted. But we do have to recognize the moment we're in, Paige, which is that there is a cartoonish quality to what Donald Trump is saying. There is something that is quite un-American in what he is saying, because if this country was founded on any principle, it was that we do not have a king. It was founded on any principle, it was that the head of state, the head of government, is not able to sort of unilaterally decide every policy and every decision without regard to the other checks and balances in the system. So, again, far be it from me to defend Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon or George W. Bush, but there's a reason why even a lot of conservative legal scholars are blanching at what Donald Trump's administration is putting forward in the name of a doctrine that, used to at least have the pretense of more respectability.
Mark, I want to talk about the courts now that you mention the courts and legal scholars. So I think we're starting to see a bit of this unitary executive theory creep into some of the legal arguments we're seeing. Many of Donald Trump's executive actions and orders are being challenged in court. And in some of the filings and oral argument, you're seeing that language of, Trump is the head of the executive branch. That gives him the power, the ability to do X, Y, Z. I think the big question is, for this theory to actually work, you would kind of need the approval of the other branches of government, right? You would need them to kind of be like, yes, the executive has wide range of powers and there's nothing we can do to stop him. But is there really an appetite? Maybe there is in Congress because John Thune and Mike Johnson are spineless cowards, but is there an appetite in the judiciary to say, yes, it is not the role of the courts to check the actions of the executive branch?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question you ask. I mean, let's first dispense with Congress. Um, Mike Johnson is theoretically third in line to the presidency. Um, in reality, he has as much importance in Washington, D.C. as a puddle, like a shallow puddle of water. Like he's sort of to be stepped over if you can. If you can't, you step on it. You get a little wet, but otherwise you just move on with life. Like he's just an irrelevancy. John Thune is like trying to blend in and be a puddle. He's less than a puddle. He's maybe like a half a puddle. Like he literally doesn't want anyone to even know that he is the Senate Majority Leader. The Republicans in Congress want you to believe that they have not read anything going on. They don't know anything going on. They're not responsible for anything going on, even though they're in the majority. And I'm going to say something that I just have to say, any of you who think that the most productive thing you can do with your time is to bash Democrats, you need to reevaluate your priorities. The problem right now is not congressional Democrats. The problem right now are congressional Republicans. Okay, they run the show, and they are the problem. Put Democrats in charge in the House and the Senate, you'd have a very different situation right now. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. But Paige, so the legislative branch under these Republicans, they don't want to be a check and balance. They literally want to just be a puddle. The courts are different. The one thing John Roberts cares about more than anything else is the primacy of the judicial decisions, right? That what they say is the final word. And so one could imagine a counter universe, a universe in which you had a much more strategic Trump administration. And it would have gone something like this. On day one, they would have issued a handful of executive orders. One of them, for example, might have targeted USAID. They would have issued that executive order. It would have been challenged in court, and they would have lost, okay? And then they would have said, okay, we're going to keep funding USAID while this case goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then when it gets to the Supreme Court, then John Roberts and the conservative majority are sitting there being like, okay, well, yeah, USAID is founded by Congress. It's a congressional statute. But on the other hand, he is the president of the United States. It deals with foreign aid. Foreign affairs are like quintessentially presidential powers. And you could almost see the opinion writing itself, right? Like the conservatives on the court kind of want to get along here with the Trump administration. They're only asking about USAID. After all, they've complied with the court's orders up until now. And, maybe they give that to him. And what ends up happening is Donald Trump leaves the Supreme Court with a big victory that he could then rolls out to other agencies. Instead, what they've done is they've now rolled this out all over the place. It's not just USAID, it's the Treasury Department, it's it's NIH, it's all of these other agencies, Department of Education Department, and the justices are reading in the newspaper every day that this is causing all kinds of trouble and mayhem. And then on top of it, you have the White House and these various DOJ lawyers seemingly playing games with the judiciary, game of cat and mouse. We're not going to tell you this. Oh, you misunderstood that. We're going to do this. We're not going to do that. And it is definitely challenging the one thing that John Roberts cares most about, which is that people think the courts and its orders are the final word. And so I think in some ways the Trump administration is doing itself a real disservice in the way in which these cases are proceeding up to the courts. Now, doesn't mean that in the end they will lose. You still have at least a couple of justices, if not three of them, who I think will probably go along with this. But I do think they have probably cost themselves at least one vote, if not others, on the Supreme Court by simply being as contemptuous. And I don't mean that necessarily in the literal sense, although they may be held in contempt at some point soon, but in the way in which they are dealing with the courts. I think that there is no question that there is a disrespect that is being shown to the federal judiciary. And I think to the extent the Supreme Court gets a sense that part of the unitary executive theory here is the undermining of court authority, then they may wind up losing some cases that they thought they were going to win. And Paige, I think that's what happened with the independent state legislature theory, because, independent state legislature theory on its face is the kind of doctrine that you would imagine conservatives on the Supreme Court would be open to. But as that case progressed, and certainly as it got argued in the court, if you listen to that argument, it had a little bit again of this feel of like, well, Your Honor, the courts aren't so important. And that's the thing that I think snapped them back there, and it may wind up snapping them back here. So Paige, look, that I think is where we stand today. But of course, this is going to be a very dynamic situation.
Mark, as these lawsuits challenging Trump's actions progress throughout the court system, do you think we'll see the Trump administration kind of double down on these arguments, or will they, kind of button up and professionalize and try to hold it together a bit more until they get a stamp of approval from a judge, or maybe Congress, legislates that they can defund USAID or that they can withhold funds, like wait for approval for someone before they actually let all hell break loose?
No, I think they're doubling down. I don't think that. I think that they've been given every opportunity by the courts to button it up and be more professional and let this proceed in a more orderly fashion, and they have rejected it. And honestly, they have left a number of their lawyers hung out to dry. And I think a lot of those lawyers may wind up worse for this experience, because I think some of the federal judges are at the end of the rope with the lawyers. I mean, the lawyers are standing in their courtrooms telling them things that turn out not to be true. And like, you get only so many times that you get to say to the judge, I didn't know, Your Honor. Like at some point that starts to splash on you. And the second thing is you're starting to see lawyers who are starting to adopt the sort of mentality, a little bit of the swagger of the Trump administration in seemingly not wanting to answer judges and basically telling them that to the judges. And so I think this is not sitting well, and I think this will age badly, but I think that the Trump administration is all in on this. And, we are not at a constitutional crisis yet, because we have not reached that point of complete loggerheads where they're ignoring court orders. But every day that goes by, the Trump administration is not showing signs that it is smartening up here. It is showing signs that it is doubling down. And look, this is the time for you, the viewers, to make sure that you are also doubling down and staying up to date, that you know what is going on in all of these cases and what more generally is going on with our democracy. And 5 years ago, I started Democracy Docket to be an independent news source that provides fearless, accurate information to you, accountable to no billionaires, no corporate interests. And so please take a second to click on the link above or in the show notes below to become a subscriber to Democracy Docket and stay up to date on all of that. We will see you next time.